Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Alejandra Barraza. I am the president of HighScope Educational Research Foundation. We want to welcome you to our roundtable today, Early Educators' Ideas about Teaching Within Marginalized Communities, which is part of the Segregation by Experience, Agency, Racism, and Learning in the Early Grades book study. HighScope is proud to host these roundtables in an effort to advocate for important issues that we are seeing in the field of early childhood. This afternoon, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Anna Faulkner, who is an assistant professor of instruction and curriculum leadership at the University of Memphis. She is a former preschool and elementary school teacher. Anna uses critical ethnographic methods of research to research how young children learn about social issues such as race and racism, and how teachers support them in their inquiries. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Faulkner.
Thank you so much for having me. It is such a pleasure to be here today. I would like to introduce our wonderful panelists today, beginning with Dr. Keffrelyn Brown. Dr. Brown is professor and distinguished university teaching professor of cultural studies and education in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at UT Austin. She holds a faculty appointment in the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies, the John L. Warfield Center for African and African American Studies, and the Center for Women and Gender Studies. Her research and teaching focuses on the sociocultural knowledge of race in teaching and curriculum, critical multicultural teacher education, and the educational discourses and intellectual thought related to African Americans and their educational experiences in the U.S. Welcome, Dr. Brown. We're also joined by Dr. Christian Zuniga. She's an assistant professor of bilingual education and teacher education at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. Dr. Zuniga's research uses language policy and ideology frameworks to examine the ways in which bilingual communities from the U.S. Mexico borderlands, especially teachers, teacher candidates, and parents, understand bilingualism and how these understandings impact localized language policy in bilingual classrooms. I'd like to begin by asking both the panelists a sort of opening general question. Based on the chapter that we read for this week and your own research, what is deficit thinking and how have each of you seen deficit thinking play a role in education? And we'll begin, I believe, with Dr. Brown.
Okay. Put my PowerPoint up for you all. Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you so much for having me. I hope that you all are able to see the screen. Is the screen up correctly?
We can see your presenter mode, but we can.
Oh, you can. Okay, then let me stop. Then I didn't click something correctly.
While she's getting that up, please feel free, everyone, to put your questions into the chat.
Okay, welcome everyone. I'm glad to be here and I look forward to chatting with you all today. My presentation or my little quick comments are going to focus on what I'm calling stories, mind frames, blind spots, and deficit thinking. And in many ways, I want to couch this conversation in the context of stories and what we understand to be stories. I'm going to argue that stories are things that we tell. And based on the chapter that everyone read, there were very explicit stories that were told in the classroom. And those stories look different depending on who was talking. So I want to start by talking about mind frames. So what is a mind frame? I draw from two ideas here when I use the term mind frame: frames and mindsets. And you may have heard the term mindsets used in education. We think of mind frames as just a way of organizing and thinking about the world. It's a frame in a way that helps us to see and understand ourselves, others, and how we all exist and operate within the world. A frame is just simply something that demarcates, it sets a boundary. But what's really powerful about a frame is that it makes a sort of distinction between something that's inside and something that's outside. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. When we think of mindsets, many of you have probably heard or are familiar with, or maybe even hold certain kinds of mindsets about students and student learning. Two really important mindsets, I think, that play out in our field in education are growth mindsets and deficit mindsets. So Carol Dweck, a psychologist, argues that when one holds a growth mindset, there is a belief that students and teachers and individuals can grow in their understanding of the world. This is not something that they just sort of, you either have knowledge or you don't have it, you have ability or you don't have ability. You can grow into and develop into whatever it is that you want to develop or want to know more about. Whereas deficit mindsets have a sort of different orientation, which we'll spend some time unpacking in this presentation. And deficit mindsets do not move from a growth perspective. They really are rooted in understanding and the belief that some people are lacking and need additional intervention in order to be successful. Now, when we think about mind frames as stories, we're just simply saying that there are certain frames and ways of thinking about the world that are repetitive, they're pervasive, and they tend to be taken for granted. In other words, when someone comes at us with an alternative view or a view that doesn't fit the frame that we already hold, in this case, in the chapter that we read, a frame for how young children should be allowed to move and interact in a classroom. Sometimes that knowledge is so taken for granted that you don't have to think about it really unless you're pushed to have to think about it. That knowledge is just accepted as truth. It's accepted as truth that young children should not be given space to move around in classrooms until they are ready. And by ready, that means that they are abiding by and are full control of themselves related to the rules that have been set by the instructor. At least that's what we got in the chapter. Now, these stories that we hear and that we tell ourselves and others do a couple of different things. First, they guide our views of the world and others. They provide a frame to make sense of and to read our own personal experiences. And we saw this in the chapter as well, right? We saw how there were educators were watching film and they were trying to make sense of their own experiences in the classroom with young children in relation to what they were seeing in those film. And what they were seeing in the film in many ways rubbed up against their own experiences. And so they had to try to make sense of that through their stories, their mind frames. These stories also inform judgments and decisions that we make in the classroom, how we judge what's going on in those spaces. But more importantly, they prove very difficult to change or to transform. It's hard to disrupt those stories. But we know that they exist in sociocultural contexts that are recognized and unfortunately that sometimes are rendered invisible. We don't actually see the context. This is what was really beautiful about that chapter, how the researchers were able to really point out the way that race and socioeconomic status in some cases played a role in how children's behavior was viewed by teachers, right? That certain children, it was believed, needed to be more controlled. That they didn't have the capability to be autonomous and to make their own decisions and to be free within that space. Now, you probably already picked up on this idea that stories themselves are challenging because stories always contain blind spots. And so we can't really talk about mind frames and stories without addressing blind spots. And a blind spot is just simply a spot where we just aren't able to see something. And as a result, that lack of vision leads us to become unaware that we can't see, right? And so probably the most classic form of blind spot is when we're driving, right? New drivers learn this early in their training, that there is a blind spot, and we have some corrective tools in the car to try to help you address those blind spots, because there's a place where you cannot see, your eyes will not allow you to see that small space. And if you try to move over, you might hit someone. So we have rear view mirrors. We also have the mirrors that are on either side of the car. And if all of those fail, as my driver education teacher told me, just take a quick turn so you can see what's physically there. Blind spots, because they make it difficult for us to be aware of what it is we cannot see, makes them insidious and dangerous, right? And we have some scholars who have discussed blind spots essentially as being biases, right? They are often rooted in misinformation or information that we just don't have access to. They often operate in unconscious ways, right? Maybe we don't even realize that those blind spots are playing a role in the way that we're looking at the world, but they are nonetheless very influential. So when we think about blind spots in the context of classrooms, and what blind spots can do, when we don't recognize that we have a blind spot and we just continue to do work as usual, the consequences are that we often aren't able to meet our students' needs. And in the context of the research study that we're reading about, students' needs for their students' needs for agency and for freedom, so that they can develop the kinds of critical thinking abilities, problem-solving abilities, and just relational needs are not being met. But the chapter also points out that there were real academic, real content area needs that students had that they weren't able to practice and to develop because they didn't have the space to engage in the kind of discourse and conversation and interactions that might have been very helpful in helping them to gain the vocabulary and other content that the teachers wanted them to gain. When these blind spots also create spaces where student achievement or their lack of success is not seen as connected to the actual organization of the space itself, the learning environment. And this is not to blame in any way teachers, but to think about how, as educators, our job is to create spaces where our students, where we can facilitate the learning of our students in a variety of different ways. What that essentially means is that the way that classroom space is organized, really, we believe that it really can impact and does impact whether students can learn or not. And if we have a blind spot, then we might not actually stop and say, I wonder if there's something that I might be able to do differently, or if there's something we can do differently in our school that actually will allow our students to develop in the ways that we really want them to develop. Rather, the blame will be placed on students or on their communities or on their families for not doing something that is believed that they need to do before they can actually learn. One of the other ways that blind spots operate is that they have consequences on assumptions that are held about who our students and our families are. We consequently can hold low expectations for students. We don't believe that they can engage in autonomy and it'll give them space for agency. And this can lead us to just get frustrated sometimes with the intense amount of work that we're asked to do. Finally, when we know that we actually have a blind spot, when we become aware of this, and I think that this is probably the most powerful position that any educator can be in, when we recognize that we do have blind spots, we need to work towards figuring out how I can try to see those things that I might not be able to see. And the consequences on that are that we have a responsibility. We recognize that it's important for us to teach all of our students and teach them well, to provide space for them to grow in the ways that we want them to grow and we know that they need to grow, even when we might feel like they might not be ready, or we're pushing back against a narrative that says you can't do this work until they're ready. It also asks that we engage in constant critical reflection. So when we see opportunities to think differently about what we're doing in the classroom, we take those opportunities. And finally, we can seek out a community of learners, other people that can work alongside us and to help us to see the things that we might not see, which again is another beauty of this research study, that it actually helps us to see some of those blind spots. So what makes these blind spots possible? And I want to make it very clear, and I don't want to turn this into an academic lecture, but I do want to spend a little bit of time acknowledging the fact that these perspectives that we hold about and the stories that we tell about young children or learners in general are not things that we just have, they're somehow idiosyncratic to each of us individually. Really, they are a part of the larger system, larger body of societal knowledge that we come to learn in a variety of different ways that help us make sense of our work in the classroom. So when we think about deficit thinking in particular, I want to talk a little bit about where that, how do we sort of arrive at this kind of a space? And I want to ground this in the notion of normalization. And I guess I should say before I get into normalization, that there are three really important components to normalization. The first, there's the idea of othering, that in our society, we have had practices of othering peoples, right? And othering is a frame, right? It's those things and people that exist outside of these artificial boundaries of what is considered normal or not, right? Often we individuals recognize how we look at the world as being normal, right? And everything else that's outside of that is considered different or deviant, right? And so othering is a strategy that's used where we can talk about that group. So we might talk about these particular children aren't ready for X, Y, and Z in the classroom. And that's a form of othering, right? And they are othered because somehow they exceed and go beyond the limits of what artificially in some ways has been constructed as being normal. Once you are acting in a way that is normal, then I know you no longer are the other, right? You're normal. Anything outside of normalcy is deviance. Now, these ideas of what is normal come to us in a variety of ways, whether it's popular discourses, academic discourses, or even scholarly discourses. We learn about what is normal in school. We're told what's normal. We learn about it in our families and in our communities and in our schools and in our, in our places of work. We learn them on television. There's a lot of different places where we are fed information about what is considered normal or not. Once we know what's normal, then it's not so difficult to sort of identify those things outside of normal as being different, deviant, or other. Now, what often happens is that what is seen as normal what is seen as normal becomes recognized as true. And even those things that are recognized as abnormal. So it is true that for children who are of color and who may come from lower income backgrounds or from working class backgrounds, or whose first language is in English, need to have rules set in place before we can allow them freedom to speak without raising their hand, or to, find a friend and choose where you're going to sit in class. That becomes recognized as true. And as a result, we then place a disciplinary gaze on the other. We start to control the other, right? And we saw examples of that in this study. So deficit thinking is one of the most important, I would say, forms of normalization that we have, that works and plays a role in education. And as I close out, I want to sort of think about deficit thinking. I've given a definition of it. Well, you know what? I don't know if I actually gave a definition. So let's say, what is a definition? Deficit thinking is the belief that academic struggle is the result of flawed or undeveloped genetic makeup, cultural background, and or students' individual experiences, right? That would include just being young. That would be another perspective, that there's something that the student is lacking. And this definition comes from the work of Jeannie Oakes. When we think about how deficit thinking plays out in practice, it assumes that students, families, and communities are lacking and need remediation or control. It also assumes that students come to school without relevant knowledge and experiences. It fails to take responsibility for programmatic, institutional, and or structural challenges, right? So there are some real sort of long-standing implications that can come from the story that's connected to a mind frame and a blind spot, this notion of deficit thinking. I am going to sort of go to the end to talk a little bit. I want to share at least a few strategies that one might use to try and disrupt deficit thinking in practice before my time ends. First, I would say that it's important for staff to critically reflect on mind frames and blind spots, to really think about what are the mind frames that exist in how we look at our work with young children in the classroom. And then ask the question, are there any blind spots that might be playing out, or how might we go about figuring out those blind spots that may be impacting the way that we're addressing our work? And this should be applied in the planning process. This is something that the whole school can engage in. We also need to make it a priority to disrupt deficit thinking, right? Allocating time and resources to address these issues, and have opportunities for targeted professional development that looks directly at that topic, bringing in outsiders to help assist and evaluate in that progress. And why do you need those outsiders? Because they often are able to show you those blind spots that you might not be able to see because you're right in the middle of it. Monitor and question the language that we actually use to talk about various students. What are the assumptions we make about our students, and how do we talk about them? And sometimes we don't mean any harm, but we're not even really conscious about the way that we are talking about students. And then finally, identifying and focusing on those challenges and assets that our students bring to school. What are the things that they do and do wonderfully, and show that they are capable learners? How do we sort of maximize those in how we are approaching, looking at, and working with our students? So I'm going to stop now, and I look forward to chatting with you all a little bit later in the presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brown. We're going to turn it over to Dr. Zuniga now for her thoughts.
All right, can everybody see? So, all right, good afternoon. Thank you all so much for inviting me to be here today. I'm going to be talking about language ideology and language rights, bridging the chapter that we saw in the book by Cogrove and Sanchez Suzuki, about what does this mean for our students who are linguistic minorities in the context of the US. Before I begin, I want to go over a few terms that I'll be using. I do want to point out that I am contextualizing this within the framework of the US. So I'm going to give a little background because I know that we do have an international audience. So in my work, I look at language ideology and orientation. And so I thank Dr. Brown for going first, because I think the framework that she described and laid out for us is very parallel to these ideas. So language ideologies are these accepted common sense, things that we take for granted that we know about language, that we know to be true about language. And this particularly has an evaluative component where we judge the language practices of others. And this is how we decide who speaks well, who doesn't speak well, who knows language, who doesn't, who's proficient. And these judgments are often laid out by how the speakers of those language or the people who enact certain language practices, how they're viewed by society. So certainly power structures of race and ethnicity and social class play a role in who we deem as having good versus bad language practices. Now, language ideology isn't just things that we think, but there are also things that we enact. So from a policy perspective, what we think about language gets enacted, especially in our schools, from the perspective of the language programs that we offer. So Richard Rees laid out a seminal framework saying that we often, our policy when it comes to language, and this is on the global scale for sure, but speaking about the US, we often see language as a resource. So certainly in the last 20 years in the US, we've seen a better view towards bilingualism and multilingualism, especially for its cognitive benefits, its economic benefits. But for a long time, multilingualism and bilingualism had been situated as a problem. So this idea that children who didn't speak English had a problem that needed to be fixed. And in a lot of ways, that's still true today. But then we're invited to think about, well, what about language as a right? Who has the right to keep and maintain their language? And how do our language ideologies impact who has that kind of agency? In the US, for bilingual education, we have kind of a gamut of programs that fall under this umbrella. In very general terms, bilingual education refers to any program where there is more than one language present as instruction. But we have different programs with different orientations. So right now we have a lot of dual language immersion programs, which aims to develop the first language while learning the second. It often groups children from the dominant language and the minoritized language together. And at least on its surface level, it does present a language as resource framework. So this idea that bilingualism, multilingualism is good, especially in today's more globalized economy. But we also have transitional programs, which have kind of been the norm in the US, and this uses the first language to transition students into the second. So typically students start their early childhood elementary grades in mostly, I'm going to speak mostly to Spanish English bilingual programs, although certainly there are other programs like Chinese English, German English in different parts of the country, depending on the populations. And then students are transitioned into English. This usually happens at third grade. And after that, English becomes the only language of instruction. And so for those kind of programs, language has always been positioned as a problem. So students don't know English, that's a problem that needs to be fixed. So these are kind of the ways that language works here in the US in terms of our programs. Now, as I was reading the book by Adair and Sanchez Suzuki Cogrove, I was drawn to this quote because I think this quote speaks a lot to the research that I've done with teachers who grew up on the U.S. Mexico border and now teach in our schools in the U.S. Mexico borderlands. So they say that while educators' deficit thinking revealed that many did not seem to think that children within their schools were capable, smart, or ready to enact their agency, we now think that many educators in our study may have felt the same way about themselves. And so I think this is important to look at, because ideologies are not just about the way we see people, but the way that we see ourselves as well. And how we see ourselves can impact then how we view others. And so I'm going to present to you the case of Karina. Karina actually was a participant in a study that I did, and was a member of the study, of part of the larger study presented in the book. So I'm going to use Karina as kind of a sample case for you to get an idea of how some of these teachers who were vocalizing these very deficit thinking perspectives, what was their background like? And I don't mean to present her as a generalized that this was true of all teachers. I think that Karina's story does present a cross-section of those participants. So Karina was born and raised on the U.S. Mexico border. She was born to Mexican immigrant parents. Spanish was the dominant language at home. And when it came to home literacy practices, she reported that there were magazines and newspapers in Spanish present in her home. And there was frequent cross-border travel between her home in the US and her home and her connections to Mexico. So this is kind of Karina's upbringing, or the way that she grew up with language. Now I'm giving you a little context here about the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. This is where I'm located. This is where Karina was born and raised. And this is also an area where many of the participants from the book were interviewed. And so it's important to think of the U.S.-Mexico border as this geopolitical space, right? Where these two countries, cultures, languages, ideologies kind of come together. And so the border has very much been shaped by events that are related to colonization, imperialism, war, human migration. And so as people have come together, sometimes out of necessity, sometimes by force and obligation, something that's happened is that obviously they've developed their own ways of speaking, or what we call border languaging, that's very akin to the border. So in terms of language, and the reason I bring this up is because there was a lot of conception among the teachers that certain students didn't have language, or they didn't have vocabulary. And that's something that gets voiced a lot. So when I interview bilingual teachers, I often have them tell me that their students are semilingual, or even worse, alingual, meaning they don't have a language in either English or Spanish. And often the students are reflecting, and the teachers themselves are reflecting kind of the larger languaging practices of the border. So they're engaging in Tex-Mex and Spanglish. Tex-Mex is a variety that I would define or describe as incorporating elements of English spoken in South Texas and the Spanish spoken in northern Mexico. And then Spanglish being kind of more of a pan-language term to think of Spanish and English more broadly. Code switching is common, and that evokes a lot of emotion about what if code switching is good or bad. I will say that that is very common practice. So people do it, but there are people who will not admit to it being a good practice, even though from a linguistics perspective, it's simply a natural way that people who speak two languages speak. And it is very structured and rule governed, contrary to the popular ideology that it's patched up work that people use when they don't know a language. And actually the research shows that code switching shows that it's because speakers have a very good understanding of the syntactic systems of the two languages that they're able to bridge them together. And so finally, as we're talking about these two communities, we're talking about larger translanguaging processes. So translanguaging looks at languages, not as English and Spanish related, English the US, Spanish Mexico, but as more of these integrated language systems that communities on the border use to communicate and make sense of their worlds. So on code switching, Karina tells us that it's not good practice, that it's not academic, and that she doesn't let her children and her students in her class use English or Spanish at all. She doesn't want them just to put in words. Karina was a third grade teacher. She had over 35 years of experience, had multiple certifications, had a master's in reading instruction, You'll note that her school was very similar to the schools in the book. 95% identified as economically disadvantaged, 65% identified as learners of English. Most of the students of her class were either immigrants themselves or the children of immigrants. And she was enacting a dual language program, which in theory was supposed to support students learn both languages. But something that happened is that her principal eradicated that program because students had to contend with the high stakes testing system. So as we see here, everything went into English, with Spanish only being used if there was the need to get a point across. So the dual language program, that kind of enrichment-oriented program that was supposed to help foster English and Spanish, fell by the wayside, leaving students to basically end up in a kind of ESL, English as a second language, so some first language support, / transitional bilingual ed, where we had some Spanish support, but really the goal was English. So now language became a problem because students didn't speak English and they were contending with the Texas system of assessment and standardization. So in the US, we use high stakes assessment to measure schools and how well they're doing. And if schools don't do well, there can be really serious punishment for the schools, for the teachers, and for the students themselves. So in Texas, that begins at the 3rd grade with reading and math. Critics have really highlighted how these tests narrow the curriculum where only the tested subjects are taught. Instruction is focused on test preparation, and this is especially evident in classrooms where there are large minoritized populations, meaning effectively that learning becomes very rote and centered on a test. And the high stakes assessment privileges English because ultimately schools have to show that they're getting their students to test in English. So that means that bilingual goals fall out the wayside and English becomes the ultimate goal. So when I asked Karina, who is bilingual, because that's essentially what I was wanting to study, she said that bilingual is a person that can adequately communicate in 2 languages, fairly proficient in his or her native language, and has picked up the second language. She also says that she doesn't feel her own Spanish is adequate. Her parents were parents that came from Mexico, and they believed in education, but they didn't believe in having books at home. So she didn't read it enough. And so when I asked Karina what she thought about having kids, be pushed into English as opposed to dual language, she actually said that she very much supported that. Karina was a very practical person. And I want to highlight that she knew the system her students had to play. And she knew that the system was going to reward their English rather than them developing their Spanish. But I do want to highlight here that for Karina, the ability to be bilingual was very much premised on having a strong, solid first language, and that certain language practices like having books at home were important. And Karina had told me that there actually were magazines and newspapers at her house, but she didn't consider those as actual resources that would be conducive to her learning. So when I asked, well, what does it mean then to be fluent? Karina told me that the reason the dual language program wouldn't work for her students is because it's based on the premise that you have to be a fluent native speaker, which means that you have to be fluent reader in Spanish. You have to have very good vocabulary. So we can kind of see the starting of the conversations of vocabulary that the chapter saw. And the majority of our children, the children at her school, are limited Spanish speakers. So they do not have the ability to pick up that second language. And all these vowel sounds and the spelling patterns in English need to be taught. So essentially for Karina, doing away with the dual language program wasn't necessarily a bad thing because for her, many of her students were not strong in Spanish, which was their first language. And when I asked her which students do you think are the most likely to benefit from dual language, the students she pointed out were students who in her mind had strong Spanish literacy skills, including vocabulary, fluency, and phonics. . So as I close out, I want to talk about this idea. I want to circle back to the idea of agency that Adair and Sanchez Suzuki Cogrove highlight for us. As we saw here for Karina, bilingualism was premised on these ideas that there had to be certain prereqs for you to benefit from a dual language program. You had to have first language proficiency, and that was measured by how good your vocabulary was and how good your phonics was and your fluency was. It was based on having certain home literacy practices at home. So for her, she wasn't herself proficient because she didn't have books at home. And there had to be academic success. So for Karina, if students weren't doing well in her class, then how were they going to benefit from a dual language program? It was best to teach them English and get them into a monolingual English track. So what this leaves me with as I was reading the chapter is that agency is essentially related to language rights. So the authors lay out the idea that agency is something that we are born with, but not everyone gets to enact. And that's very much situated in the context that we're in. And so essentially what we're seeing is that there are students who have the full potential to be bilingual because they are bringing in a language that is not English into the classroom, who could potentially have that first language developed while they learn English, being removed from that opportunity. And so what we're seeing a lot of times here in the US is that within one school, we have these two-tier systems where we have dual language education, many times for white upper middle class students who already know English, so they can be bilingual, or Spanish speaking students who are performing very well, and students who are not perceived to be doing well academically or have certain language practices and home literacy practices, then they should be on a path where English becomes the main method of instruction. And so obviously their right to learn and develop and continue to pass on the home language of their families essentially becomes erased. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you both very much. I'd like to remind all of our attendees to please drop your questions in the Q&A box so that, because we have about 10 to 15 more minutes, and I'd love to be able to pass on your questions to our panelists here today. I would like to ask Dr. Brown, if you would speak a little bit about how have these stories, these deficit views of children and families changed and developed over time? How have they gotten embedded in the systems and the practices of education?
That's a really great great question. And I'll answer it to the best of my ability by giving some information that I know from my own research, and also recognizing that, this is not something that this is something that I have researched, but it is not something that I have continued to research. So I imagine that there may be some newer developments in the contemporary times. But if we go back to the earliest stages of public schooling in the United States, compulsory public schooling, we had more widespread public schooling around the early 1900s. We found that there were children who were positioned as outside of the norm, and they have always been a part of schooling. And there have always been terms and categories used to describe them. And those terms and categories have always positioned those groups as other and as different and deviant from the norm. And historically, the challenge in schools has been to identify those young people or those learners, figure out what it is they don't know, what they need, and then we're going to give it to them. So whether the term, and I don't mean to be offensive, but I really want you all to get a flavor of what the history of these terms, whether the term imbecile was actually a category of person, right? Problem student was a term that was used. Educationally disadvantaged, if we get to the 1960s, right? We've always had these categories of people, and even now we probably use terms like at risk. to talk about students who are seen as outside of the norm. And I would say for young learners, readiness is really seen as important, right? You've got to come to school ready to learn. And any young person that is seen as not ready to learn is automatically going to be seen as potentially at risk of not either learning how to read, learning how to speak English if English is not their first language. If there are just ways that they behave that aren't in alignment with the standards that school space holds, they may be seen as at risk in that way. And so I think that young children are probably more apt in this era to be identified in that way because of fears that we somehow are going to let some children slip through the cracks.
Thank you very much. Dr. Zuniga, how do you think our current educational climate reflects those deficit views, particularly around language? And the examples that you gave are so powerful in thinking about the ways in which standardized testing, for example, influences the decisions that schools and districts are making about language. So can you speak a little bit more about how that impacts children's schooling experiences?
Sure. So, definitely the example you pointed at, I think that high-stakes testing has really played a role in how we see students as having the possibility to learn and not. And even in the way that we prepare them, we talk about, schools have become, they almost plan out, who can pass, who can't pass, who can realistically do this. Schools talk about the triage kids, if they work a little harder, they'll pass. And the other kids, they probably aren't. So just kind of, do what you can with them. So I think the standardized testing, because of the way it's set up in ways that's very culturally and linguistically biased for a lot of, I study mostly our emerging bilingual students. And we blame the students. So kind of to the point of the book, we blame the students for not being able to make the very complicated language of math and science in English comprehensible to them and failing. So I certainly think that high stakes assessment has played a role. To Dr. Brown's point, this idea of how we assess our students and setting them up for failure has always kind of been present in our educational system. So everything from IQ tests to the high stakes tests we have today, they perpetuate this idea, these ideologies, these mind frames, as Dr. Brown said, about the stories we already believe to be true about children. And then we use this data, biased as it is, we use this data to say, see, these kids are not teachable. They can't pass, or only certain kids can pass. Only the kids that behave well, only the kids that can be trusted to sit still, walk in a straight line, that can show us the possibility to be agentic, can really learn. And so I think that's been an area where it continues to be a problem. And then I would also add, now with the pandemic, we really became aware, I think that was always noticeable, but we really became aware of just the large digital divide for many of our students. And so what I'm hearing now as teachers is a lot of this, we call this the pobrecito syndrome, poor kids. And poor kids often translate not into let me help them, but I feel sorry for them, and therefore I have no expectations for them. So right now we have, down here on the Mexico border, we've had a lot of issue with getting hotspots, Wi-Fi reception. For a lot of our communities, we've realized that there are families who have one device for the household to do homework. And we're starting to be like, well, what happens with these children? And are we going to do anything about it? Or are we going to fall into the pobrecito syndrome where we're just going to be like, well, it is what it is. And that's it.
Thank you very much. We have a few questions from some of our participants. We have one here. Dr. Brown, how can I be more observant to recognize blind spots in the classroom? I've been a preschool teacher for over 30 years, and this is the first time I'm hearing about blind spots. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. You know, it's a complicated question because it's hard to know what we don't know. But I think one of the best ways that we can do this is by building strong community in our workspaces where we can have trusted peers and colleagues that can observe our classrooms, or that we can share challenging issues that may be coming up to see if there are ways that we might not be thinking about the work that we're doing. And I think that what's going to be important is that you actually say that that's what you're looking for. Like, I'm looking for potential blind spots. So maybe, you know, I asked the question, this is what I'm seeing. What are some things that I might not be seeing? And you can ask for that person or group of people to do that for you, and to create a really safe space where this is the norm. This is what we do, because we know that there's always going to be blind spots. And the only way that we can attend to them is to actually attend to them and be willing to address those challenges. So I hope that makes sense. It's very simple, but I actually think it's something that we probably don't always do in intentional ways.
Absolutely. And I love the idea of that sense of community and the communal work of looking for those things. So the next question is this: the era of this pandemic has brought much of our thinking to the forefront about the points discussed. Where do we go from here? And what are your opinions about what strategies will be most beneficial? Dr. Zuniga, if you want to start with this one, this may be one that you both want to speak to.
Sure. I'll go off my experience as a teacher educator. So I've been a teacher educator for over a decade now, but something that I personally learned from the pandemic is that how many of our teachers struggled with the incorporation of technology. Technology, and it can do not just in these fun activities, but in really, you know, being really conducive to online learning. And so for me, my challenge has been, how do I bridge that with engaging teachers in these kind of critical perspectives about language? And how do we engage them in these, I saw in the chat that someone asked about, you know, culturally sustaining pedagogies. You know, how do we bridge that in terms of technology? And so at least something that I've been doing with my teachers is I've been forcing them to do the work. You know, let's look at some of these technology tools. How can we use them, learn them? How do you see yourself kind of using this in the classroom? And thinking, and we have discussions at the end, you know, so what would this, you know, what does this look like when, you know, if you're in one of the schools of the region, you know, where right now the city is trying to get grants to put a Wi-Fi spot there because there's so many families who don't. And so we talk about those realities. We talk about that digital divide. And, you know, what are some ways that we can bridge this with more culturally sustaining practices? So something I have my students do is I have them, you know, create a digital book, and where they go out into the community and they look at the linguistic landscape of the community, and they use it as something that they can use for them to study the linguistic landscape, but also use it to understand the communities that they'll be serving. And as also a way to teach students about, you know, I'm like, if you want to talk about sight words, let's talk about the sight words that our students see all the time. You know, you want to talk about vocabulary building, let's start with all the words that our students do see, as opposed to the ones that, you know, we focus that they just supposedly don't have.
Great. I'll just add a little bit to that. My partner, my husband, is also a professor. And so when the pandemic hit, we were teaching at home and our children were home. And so I had a 6th grader and a 2nd grader at home. And I'm sure many of us on this call had to navigate home schooling. So we ended up writing about this. We were asked to write about what does it mean to be an education researcher, and then you were at home with your children. And I'm a former teacher as well. He's a former teacher and school administrator. And what I found is that there were 2 things that we wrote about that were really powerful. One, there was a lot of intentionality behind what we did. Like everyone, as tired as I know the teachers and the staff were at the children's school, there was this sort of urgency and intentionality that was different than in in previous times. It's like, we've got to do something, and we need to do that something right. I feel like there also was a sort of sense of, how do I hone in on what really, really matters here? What are the core things that I want to make sure that my students get access to? And I feel like they really worked on that and tried to do those things well. There were some things that didn't get taken care of, and the students are going to have to play a little bit of catch up, but they did get the things that were really important. And thirdly, I actually think there was space for improvisation. And by that, I don't mean that teachers were just flying on the seat of their pants and just doing whatever came in their mind. They actually felt free to do things differently. And they didn't feel so stressed with this sort of expected way that they had to perform, because they had to get things done. And I actually found that space really allowed the educators to be the professionals that they are, and to really stop and say, what do I need in this moment? And I think that that's just an orientation to teaching that I think we need to have. But unfortunately, we sometimes lose that, or we don't embrace it, because we're fearful that we're not going to cover everything. We're not going to get through everything that needs to be done.
I love that, both the sense of intentionality and the way that folks felt free to try and do things differently. I think those are also helpful for us to think about what we want in terms of changing things, so that teachers do feel supported to try things new, and teachers do feel able to offer these kinds of agentic experiences. So we have really quick last thoughts. What is the one thing that you would hope for teachers to have that would help them feel like they can offer these agentic, meaningful experiences for children?
I wish teachers would trust themselves more, trust themselves as professionals, as people who are knowledgeable in their craft, not as just, people who are just doling out curriculum, but who themselves can have a lot more, they themselves can have more agency in how they teach, and believe more firmly in the things that they want to do. I often hear teachers tell me, oh, I wish I could do this, I wish I could do that, but I just don't know how it'll go. I don't know what the consequences will be. So for me, I think that it's important that our teachers just trust themselves more, see themselves as the professionals that they are.
Yes, I absolutely agree. I think that we need to see that, we need to honor that, and then we need to continue to do the work that it will take to continue developing as professionals. Being a professional doesn't mean that we know everything, and it doesn't mean that we don't need to continue learning. Actually, being a professional means that I need to continue to try to learn, and I recognize what I don't know. There's lots of questions that were still in the Q&A, and there's no way to try to bring an answer to them all. But I will say that, there were conversations about culturally responsive pedagogy and culturally sustaining pedagogies was mentioned a bit ago, as well as how growth mindsets play a role in that work, and how shifting our mindset might make us more of, make it more likely that we will be able to see our blind spots and mind frames. I would say that anyone who is embracing culturally responsive pedagogy recognizes that culturally responsive pedagogy only exists because we have a normative expectation for what teaching is supposed to look like. And that normative expectation, unfortunately, leaves out lots of different perspectives and knowledge that have not been accepted or embraced as being normal and correct, the way things are supposed to be done, which is why we end up having, and why we needed culturally responsive pedagogy to expand. In a way, it was speaking to a blind spot, a very big blind spot. So I think when you do that work, hopefully you are taking in the spirit of that work, and you're using it to guide all that you do. And so I cannot imagine that if you're truly doing culturally responsive pedagogy, that you're not embracing more of a growth mindset and pushing back against those blind spots that stand in the way of meeting all of our students' needs in an equitable and just way.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Barasa now.
Dr. Brown and Dr. Faulkner and Dr. Zuniga, thank you so much for joining us for this incredibly important conversation that follows to our book, to the book of Dr. Adair and Dr. Sanchez Suzuki Colgrove, Segregation by Experience, that can be bought through the HighScope.org for our participants. There will be certificates sent out to everyone who participated today in our conversation, and that will be done 24 hours after the conclusion of our event. We also want to remind you that it's also recorded and will be seen on the HighScope YouTube channel, so you can follow up on this conversation. And we also want to invite you can purchase it on our website, Agency Racism and Learning in the Early Grades. And you can register for our next roundtable. We continue to focus on this book, and it will be on November 17th at 2 p.m. And we will be discussing chapter 4 of the book. Thank you so much for everyone for participating. On behalf of HighScope, it's always an honor to continue these important conversations. Please learn how you can support. You can invest in HighScope.org. We remind you we are a nonprofit, and everything that comes to HighScope goes back into research. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.